Carl and Betty lived in the suburbs of Chicago, in a typical two-story house with a neat lawn and a hammock between two old maple trees. Everyone knew them as the perfect couple: 2 children, a dog named Spark, and evenings spent watching TV together after the kids went to bed. It seemed like the ordinary American family happiness that everyone strives for. But something began to break down long before that night when Carl saw a strange story on Instagram. The first cracks became noticeable about 6 months ago. Carl worked as an engineer in a small company, and Betty was an administrator at a beauty salon. She had always been energetic, able to make him laugh even after the worst day. But lately, she had become increasingly absorbed in her phone. Instead of hugs, there was a curt, "I'm tired." Instead of family evenings, there was laughter at the videos of some blogger whose name Carl couldn't even pronounce correctly. The children noticed that their mother had become irritable. She yelled at them over trifles, and then immediately cried and promised to buy them ice cream. Carl tried not to pay attention. Every family has periods when everyone is a little tired. But the anxiety wouldn't go away. He didn't like how easily Betty lied. She would say she was going to the store, but come back with a meager bag and a strange gleam in her eyes. She would promise to come to her daughter's school play and then forget about it, excusing herself with a traffic accident that never happened. Once, Carl noticed that Betty immediately hid her phone when he entered the room. When he asked her about it, she snapped, "It's work, Carl. I get tired too." He didn't immediately decide to dig through other people's messages, even his wife's, although his doubts were growing. Especially when Betty began to rave about the brilliant ideas of a popular blogger named Travis. She called him almost her idol, and when Carl accidentally mispronounced his name, she looked at him as if he had done something unforgivable. It was all very strange. Carl had always considered himself not jealous, but now he felt that the situation was getting out of control. Sometimes he remembered how they had met, how Betty had run to the bus in the rain and dropped her umbrella, and he, clumsy and silent, had picked it up. Then she laughed and said he was a real hero. Since then, he had done everything to make her feel safe. But something had changed. Betty seemed lost in a world that was foreign to Carl, a world of likes, live streams, and stories where everything was perfect until the screen disappeared. At times like these, he felt like a stranger in his own home. Fortunately, the children stayed close to him. Carl took them to the park, played board games with them, and read to them before bed. But even these small joys were overshadowed by a sense of unease. Things got even worse when Betty seemed to stop sharing news with him altogether. She began to spend more and more time on business, forgetting to let him know when she would be back. Carl found things in her bag that he couldn't explain: tickets to an event he had never heard of, lipstick she had never used before. He convinced himself for a long time that it was just fatigue, changes at work, new hobbies. But inside, he had a growing feeling that there was something else behind it. Maybe it was just a midlife crisis. Or maybe something much worse. Carl was afraid to even think that his perfect family might fall apart. Meanwhile, Betty was increasingly coming home in a state that Carl could only describe as nervous. She yelled at the children, cried, then apologized and said she was going through a difficult period. Carl tried to be there for her, to support her, to talk to her, but every time he was met with a wall of resentment, distrust, and worst of all, lies. And no matter how hard he tried to believe that this was temporary, somewhere deep down he knew that something had gone wrong. He had no idea that the next night, a regular Instagram story would turn his life upside down. That evening, Carl slept restlessly. Betty was late from work again, even though she had promised to be home early. The children were already asleep. A washed coffee cup gleamed in the kitchen, and Betty's phone lay on the dresser. It always annoyed her when Carl touched her phone, even if it was to set the alarm or check a message from the bank. But this time, something prompted him to pick up her smartphone. The screen lit up and displayed a message. Liked, Travis official added a new story. That name, Travis, was the blogger Betty had been mentioning more often lately than the names of her own children. Carl opened Instagram, and there, among the stories, was a fresh story posted by Travis. In it, he was standing in front of a familiar room. Something about the walls, curtains, and even the books on the shelf felt painfully familiar. It was their living room. Only in the background, barely visible, was Betty walking by. She was wearing a short dress, laughing, saying something, and then the story ended. Carl felt his stomach chill. His fingers turned to ice. He looked at the story again, then again. He thought he was going crazy. Maybe it was edited? Maybe Travis had been here a long time ago. But everything around him pointed to the present. On the coffee table lay a magazine that Carl had bought only yesterday. Betty came home late, smelling of someone else's perfume and with a strange lightness in her eyes. She threw down her bag, quickly undressed, and didn't even kiss the children goodnight. Carl tried not to show that he knew anything. He didn't sleep all night, replaying what he had seen in his head. The story from the stories was before his eyes: Travis in his house, his wife in a short dress, laughter. Everything he had built over the years seemed fake. In the morning, Betty acted as if nothing had happened. She quickly got dressed and said she had a meeting at work. Carl couldn't take it any more and, left alone with himself, opened the story again. Now it was gone. But now he noticed another detail. In Betty's photo archive, there was a picture of the same party, but without Travis, just her, a glass, and someone out of frame. The photo was taken that same night. Thoughts raced through Carl's head. How long had this been going on? How many times had she brought him to their house while he was driving the kids to baseball or working late? He began to notice more and more little things: new perfume, strange gifts, unexplained disappearances. Betty was becoming more and more distant, her face like a mask. Now he could no longer pretend not to notice anything. That night, Carl couldn't take it any more and wrote to Travis from a fake account. Just, "Are you often at this house?" There was no reply, but the story disappeared, and Travis closed the page to strangers. Carl realized he was caught in a web of lies, and now he just had to find out the truth. The worst part was that Betty wasn't even trying to hide anything. She was living in two worlds. At home, she was nervous, silent, easily irritated. But on Instagram, she was smiling, light-hearted, happy with Travis, even if it was behind the scenes. Carl was still trying to convince himself that he had no right to control her, that maybe he was exaggerating. But when his daughter brought him a drawing of her mom, dad, and uncle with a phone sitting at the same table, there was no doubt left. Even the children sensed that someone new, a stranger, had appeared in their home, someone dangerous to their family. Carl understood that he couldn't go on living like this. He had to find out the truth and decide what to do next. Here's the third part: Carl's confrontation with Betty. I made Betty as nervous as possible, showing her confused excuses, psychological disorder, and how she avoids direct responsibility while revealing the reasons for her actions. I added more everyday details and the children's reactions to make the atmosphere even more vivid. In the morning, Carl woke up with the feeling that the whole world had been shaken. The sunlight seemed harsh and unreal. Betty paced around the kitchen, nervously throwing things into her bag. The children ate their cereal quietly. Carl watched his wife as if she were a stranger and couldn't decide how to start the conversation. His heart was pounding, not so much with anger as with bitterness and helplessness. He waited until the children left for school. Betty was already reaching for the door when he finally spoke. "Betty, wait. We need to talk." She froze, not even turning to face him. She just asked quietly, "About what?" "You know what." Carl tried to control himself, but his voice broke. "I saw the stories. I know Travis was in our house. You're not telling me everything." She finally turned around. Her eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an escape route. "You're overreacting, Carl. Travis is just a friend. I told you." Her voice became sharp, then softened immediately. "A friend? In our house? At night? You were wearing a dress I'd never seen before. The kids are drawing a man with a phone at our table. I'm not an idiot, Betty. How long has this been going on?" She took a step toward him and suddenly began to speak rapidly. It doesn't mean anything. He's helping me with a project. You know, I've always dreamed of having something of my own business. Travis just helped with ideas. He just admires me, but it doesn't mean anything, Carl. Carl listened and didn't recognize this person. She talked a lot, confusedly, and every sentence sounded like a lie. He remembered all the little things, the times she was rushing somewhere, her ridiculous excuses, the smell of someone else's perfume. Just tell me the truth. Did you cheat on me? Betty laughed irritably, then immediately grabbed her head. Carl, I don't want to discuss this. I'm tired, it's hard for me. You never listen to me, you're always lost in your own thoughts. You don't see how hard it is for me. I needed someone to support me. And Travis, he was there for me. I made a mistake. Okay? It doesn't mean anything. I love the kids, I love you. I just don't know how to fix everything. She spoke faster and faster, more and more confused. At one moment she started crying, then laughed loudly, then cried again. Carl stood there watching his whole life fall apart, feeling that all these excuses were worthless. If it doesn't mean anything, why did you lie? Why did the kids see him here? Why is your world only on Instagram, and at home you're a stranger? Betty shrugged, her eyes empty. I don't know. I really don't know. I was scared. I felt like life was passing me by. Travis made me feel alive again. But I didn't want that. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to. She covered her face with her hands, sobbed, and muttered something under her breath. Carl looked at her, and felt neither anger nor even despair. Only emptiness. They were silent for several minutes. At that moment, their son ran into the hallway. He had forgotten his lunch box. He looked at his mom and dad, sensing the strange atmosphere, and quickly ran away. For the first time, Carl thought, what next? He silently took his jacket, left the house, and wandered the streets for a long time, not knowing what to do next. It seemed that even the air had become heavier. He knew there was no turning back. This is the fourth part, about Carl's emotional journey, from shock and anger to the first steps of acceptance. There are many everyday and psychological details here that make his condition as realistic as possible. If you are ready, I will move on to the fifth part, Carl's decision about his future life. Carl had never felt so alone, even in a crowd. He walked down the street, heard the children shouting on the playground, smelled the cut grass, but it all seemed unreal. It was as if he had fallen into a movie where he was not the main character. He had a headache, felt empty, and inside him was a crack that was getting deeper and deeper. The first few days, he just ran away from home. He sat in his car near the supermarket, or wandered aimlessly around the city. All this time, fragments of conversations, Betty's voice, her nervous laughter, words of apology were before his eyes. He remembered how she used to laugh at his jokes, how they sat together on the roof of the car and watched the stars. All this now seemed foreign, as if he had been watching his family through a window his whole life. From the outside he might have seemed calm, he kept it together at work, didn't let his emotions show, and tried to be even more cheerful than usual with the children. But every night, when the bedroom door closed, Carl lay staring at the ceiling and felt a new, unfamiliar coldness growing in his soul. He was scared not because of the betrayal, but because the life he had built turned out to be fragile, like cardboard. His first thoughts were anger. He wanted to smash everything in the house, kick Betty out, forget her name. But every object reminded him of their life together, the photo on the wall, the cup they bought at a sale, the children's drawings, even the dog's Spark. He couldn't kick her out, forgive her, or live as before. And then fear and shame set in. Carl caught himself thinking, maybe it was his fault? Was he not attentive enough to her? Maybe he didn't talk about his work in an interesting enough way? Could he have predicted that her infatuation with someone on social media would turn out to be a real, painful romance? At one point, he even caught himself with the absurd desire to meet Travis, to understand what Carl was missing in him. But then another wave came, anger at himself. I'm a grown man, I have children, and I'm jealous of some Instagram blogger, Carl thought. It was humiliating. But worst of all, he had no one to share his pain with. Tell his friends? They would never understand. His parents? They would immediately blame Betty, and he didn't want that. The whole summer passed under the sign of this internal struggle. Carl talked a lot with his children. He tried to make sure they didn't feel the tension. But children, even the youngest ones, see everything. His daughter asked him once, "Dad, do you still love Mom?" He didn't know how to answer. Eventually, exhaustion set in. Carl stopped looking for someone to blame. Sleepless nights, endless analysis, fantasies, and memories had worn him out. One evening, when Betty came home late again, he simply said quietly, "I don't know what will happen next. But we can't live like this anymore." Betty was silent. The wild sparkle was gone from her eyes, replaced by fatigue and fear. Carl understood. He had finally let go of the situation. Anger had turned to indifference. He still cared, but it didn't hurt as much anymore. He made an appointment with a psychologist. This was the first step toward acceptance. The psychologist taught Carl to ask himself questions. What do I really want? What makes me happy? And then, for the first time in many months, Carl felt that he was still alive, that he could change something. Even after everything that had happened. The fifth part is about Carl's difficult choice, his honest conversation with Betty, their agreement to part ways without a fight, and the first steps toward a new life. I introduced an unexpected twist. Carl finds himself in blogging, but not out of envy or anger, but out of a desire to be useful, genuine, and honest. His view of the world of social media has also changed. Carl hesitated for a long time, trying to understand what was right, to forgive or to leave. He looked at the children and understood that their entire future depended on this decision. But whatever he chose, the past could not be changed. The house was silent, broken only by calls from school or the club. Betty no longer hid her depression. She became quieter, as if she had come to terms with the collapse of what had once been a family. One day, Carl suggested they sit down and talk calmly. They sat together in the kitchen, where the children used to laugh, and the conversation did not flow. Finally, he said what he had been afraid to say. "I think we need to take a break. Maybe a divorce would be fairer for everyone. I don't want to live a lie anymore. You don't look happy either." Betty was silent at first, then nodded. For the first time in a long time, her face was calm, even relieved. "I don't know how it happened, Carl. I'm not making excuses. I needed attention, support. I didn't want to betray you, but I couldn't stop myself. Travis is like a drug to me. He pretends to be interested in everything, but at home I've been invisible for a long time. I don't want the children to get used to this atmosphere. Maybe we really need to try to start over, each in our own way." The conversation was long and painful at times. For the first time in many months, Carl felt relieved. They decided to give the children maximum care, to remain good parents, and not to argue in their presence. It was difficult at first, but no one had any illusions anymore. Betty moved in with her mother. Carl stayed with the children. He worked a lot, but tried to do everything so that the children would not lack love. At the same time, he went to a psychologist, read books, and even tried new hobbies. He stopped being annoyed by the world of bloggers. On the contrary, he wanted to understand what attracted Betty. In the evenings, he tried to shoot short videos, joked, shared advice with other dads, and suddenly realized that he liked it. One day, he stumbled upon Travis's social media account. Everything there was perfect: cars, travel, cheerful girls, jokes. Carl looked at it and felt neither anger nor envy. He didn't care. His new life was difficult, but it was real. His children began to help him with the videos. They filmed recipes, experiments, and even his dog Spark became a little star. Several months passed. Carl decided to publish his first video with a candid story about divorce, pain, and betrayal. He didn't expect anything special, but overnight the video garnered hundreds of likes, comments, and support from people just like him. It turned out that his experience was not unique. Men and women who had experienced betrayal wrote to him, sharing their pain and hopes. Betty sometimes came to pick up the children. She was different now, calmer, even sadder. She was less active on Instagram. Travis soon disappeared from her life. The girl from the internet was left alone with reality. And Carl, despite everything, finally felt alive again. His story was just beginning. Here is the final, sixth part, Carl's reflections, his lessons, his new meaning in life, and harmony after the storm. The story is full of honesty, hope, and the feeling that even pain can help you grow and become a better person. A year passed. Carl hardly remembered that story, the screams and tears, the sleepless nights. Everything that seemed like the end of the world at the time was now perceived as a strange, cruel, but valuable experience. He walked with his children to school, joked, recorded videos in the evenings, and looked in the mirror with different eyes. He learned a lot. Most importantly, even after the biggest blow, you can get back up. Even when betrayal knocks you off your feet, life doesn't stop. The pain doesn't go away in a day or a week, but it teaches you to notice the little things, the warmth of your children's hands, their funny jokes, even Spark's doggy antics. Carl learned to appreciate simple things and honesty, first and foremost with himself. Blogging unexpectedly became his salvation. Carl wasn't chasing fame. He simply shared his stories, recipes, and life hacks for divorced parents. He talked about pain, fear, disappointment, and, most importantly, how not to lose yourself. His followers wrote thank you notes and shared their pain, and Carl realized that he was not alone. He also realized that most people on social media do not show their real lives, but rather a beautiful facade, and therefore it is pointless to compare oneself to such people. Sometimes he ran into Betty when she picked up or dropped off the kids. There was understanding and respect between them, but no more pain. They were able to remain friends, for the sake of the children and for themselves. Betty found another job and spent less time on her phone. Travis disappeared from her life as quickly as he had appeared. Carl began to travel more with his children. They made funny videos together, learned to make pizza, and sometimes just lay in the yard and watched the stars. Carl became a different father, closer, more open, more attentive. He stopped being afraid of new acquaintances. He learned to trust himself and the world. Sometimes his followers asked, "Carl, don't you regret everything that happened?" He answered honestly, there was nothing to regret. This was his path. Without that painful betrayal, he would never have changed, never become the man his son is proud of, the man his daughter calls a hero. He would not have been able to find the strength to believe in happiness again. Carl's story is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about the courage to remain true to oneself, about the ability to forgive and move forward. About how even from broken pieces, you can build something new, something of your own, something real. He knew there were still many challenges ahead. But this time, he was ready to face them with a smile. And whatever happened next, Carl was no longer afraid of losing. He had learned the most important thing: to be honest with himself and to love life, even when it hurts.
Subscribe and like, and send the video to your friends.